Parasha begins in the aftermath of the circumcision for Avraham at the age of 99, for Yishmael at the age of 13. And let's actually consider the very last words of the previous Sedra. If you are using the Stone Chumash, then we are starting at the beginning of our Sedra, which is on page 78. But if we look back at the very last words of the previous Sedra, Lech Lecha, so there the Torah concludes, Nimolu ito, they were circumcised with him. So on that day, Avraham circumcised himself, and that same is true for Yishmael and the other members of his household as well. The next words continue, Vayera elav Hashem be'elonei mamre. So Bal haTurim draws attention to the juxtaposition, and even though, so to speak, last week's Sedra was Lech Lecha, and now it's a week later, so we've had a sort of interval and natural changing of the subject matter. But as I'm sure you know, in the Sefer Torah, there are no divisions into chapters or subjects per se. We have paragraphs, and the paragraphs which are juxtaposed to one another imply some kind of connection. In any case, there's no great novelty to his observation, because Rashi says something quite similar, and that is that Hashem's appearance to Avraham was related to the circumcision as well. So Rashi says it was the third day of his after the bris, and Hashem came to Levakeres Hachola to visit the ailing. Avraham was, as we said before, 99 years old, and even though it seems that age and passing of years in those days during that era was not identical to what we experience today, Abraham lived to the age of 175, but nevertheless, it is evident from the context that he was considered old even for those days. We find that Sarah is skeptical as to whether Abraham can father a child. Certainly she's skeptical whether she can bear a child. So Abraham was of mature years, he was just circumcised, and Hashem appeared to him levakeres hachola. So says Rashi. Says Bal haTurim, my friend for the year, he says that the Torah here emphasizes kechom hayom. I say emphasizes because the need for those words is not immediately apparent. Let's take a look again at the first pasuk, page 78 in the Stone Chumash. Vayera elav Hashem be'elonei mamre. Hashem appeared to him in the plains of Mamre. Mamre is the name of a person. V'hu yoshev pesach ha'ohel kechom hayom, and he is sitting at the entrance of the tent in the heat of the day. Vayisayin, he lifted up his eyes and he saw the approach of three travelers, three Bedouins, three passers-by, three pagan Arabs, so he would expect. And of course, as we know, they turn out to be Malachim. But Bal haTurim quotes a medrash. He refers to a medrash which he augments the medrash, or he validates the idea of the medrash by the observation Pesach ha'ohel, the entrance of the tent, kechom hayom, at the heat of the day. So says Bal haTurim that this word kechom appears in four places in total in the Tanakh. It only appears in four places, kechom, according to the heat, or at the heat. Pesach ha'ohel kechom, he's at the entrance of the tent in the heat of the day. It says kechom hashemesh, as the heat of the sun. There's a reference kechom tzach alei or, the brilliance or the lucidity, the lucid brilliance of daylight. And then it says ve'avo kechom hayom el Beis Ishboshes, that came during the heat of the day to the home of this man Ishboshes. Now, without going into the elaboration on each of those, Bal haTurim says that this reference to the chom, to the heat, brings to mind the expression, the words that appear at the end of the prophecy of Malachi, where there is a reference to, just find that turn of phrase, the day is coming, bo'er katanur. Where is that? Hine hayom ba bo'er katanur. The day is approaching when it shall burn like the heat of an oven. Kechom hatanur. Yeah, Boer Katanua. Now that is a reference to the end of days, but it's a reference to the suffering and the retribution that will be visited upon the wicked. It is seen as a kind of stand-in for the intense heat, the like I said, the punishing heat of Gehinnom, of purgatory. With that in mind, says haTurim, that there is a remez here to the Medrash which says that at the end of days, or even let's say throughout all of history, Avraham Avinu will position himself. He will sit at the entrance of Gehenna, the gates of purgatory, and he will not allow any of his descendants to be consigned to the flames of hell. He will rescue every one of them. He will redeem his progeny, except for the one who has obscured the mark of the circumcision, because that's Briso Shel Avraham Avinu. That is the indication that this person, this man, is a descendant of Avraham Avinu because he has the mark of circumcision. He has the bris milah. And, says the Medrash, Boel Goya, someone who has intimate relations with a woman who is not Jewish. So such a person, Avraham, so to speak, is powerless to redeem such a person because that individual has spurned the covenant. Now, the interesting thing is, the Medrash actually says, in the language of the Baal HaTurim, Chutz mimi she'ba'al ha-goya, Shenimshecha Arla, so that he has obscured the mark of the circumcision. Without getting too anatomical here, it is possible in a surgically painful manner to obscure the mark of the circumcision. Let's just leave it at that. Says the Baal HaTurim, Ve'enu Makiro. Now, I wasn't sure if it meant that Avraham doesn't recognize him, and it could be in the intention as well that Avram doesn't recognize such a person, even if he knows that this person is really his own descendant and he's a Jewish person, but he was never circumcised, or actually it's talking here about someone who was circumcised as an infant, as Jewish boys tend to be at the age of 8 days, but subsequently he sought to obscure it. But when it says Venamakir, it could be that that is why he did it, because he wanted to be able to impersonate a Gentile in order to explore or to experience the opportunity of sexual adventure with all manner of women. And the presumption is that a woman would not be willing to have relations with a man who is circumcised. It shows he's Jewish. He doesn't want him. So he sought to obscure that fact in order to carry out his desire with her. And such a person is beyond the reach of Avraham Avinu to save such an individual. So the Baal HaTurim says that Nimolu ito, the last words of last week's Parasha, Vayera elav Hashem, are connected, that Hashem appeared to him because of the circumcision, and therefore when it says Kechom Hayom, there's a Pesach HaOhel, Kechom Hayom, he's sitting at the edge, at the opening of the tent, the heat of the day. It is a remez to the fires of purgatory, so that Abraham will, so to speak, guard the gates of Gehenna, and he will not allow any of his descendants to be thrust within the retribution of Gehenna. And this is the significance of the juxtaposition and the reference Kechom Hayom. Of course, the Rashi says other things about Kechom Hayom, but this is the drash that the Baal HaTurim suggests, and by pointing out the other places where it says Kechom HaShemesh, so he develops this idea. Now, there's a fascinating consideration here that just gives me an opportunity to mention a phenomenon which blights many Jewish books that were published during the Middle Ages until actually quite close to modern times, because the Russians had a similar habit, and that is censorship. They would censor Jewish books, I'm sure other books as well. In fact, to even get a license to publish a book was a difficult thing to achieve, and it had to pass the scrutiny of the government censor or the church censor. They were often the person. So, and these censors were often apostate Jews or people who were at least had a passing familiarity with rabbinic literature. So the many of the early printings of Baal HaTurim, so the censors would do two things. Either they would uh, like uh, prevent an objectionable passage from being printed in the first place, or they would threaten reprisals if it did appear in print. Or if they did appear in print and there was a passage that was objectionable, they would sometimes destroy them all, whatever they could get their hands on. And there are certainly many cases of that, if the whole book is deemed to be heretical according to the church doctrine. But at other times, they would just take a quill, a brush, and obscure the passage that is considered to be objectionable. So if a book was printed in however many copies, so they would the censor would get involved and he would black out the words that were objectionable. We find in some of the printed editions of Baal HaTurim that this passage has been obscured, has been blacked out because of the implied criticism of a Jew who masquerades as a Nachri, as a Gentile, and who, as a result, is able to pursue sexual liaisons according to his pleasure. And the implication is that this is highly objectionable in Jewish terms. Of course, it is, and therefore this is redeemed as uh, you know. To malign the church. So therefore they were blacked out, but there were some editions that have been preserved, and in any case we do find that this is the correct and the legitimate version. It's interesting that in the particular example that's published in the Art Scroll edition, they showed how a censor had blacked out this phrase or this line and a half early up in the commentary, but a few lines later, Baal HaTurim says something essentially very similar, and for whatever the reason, it's escaped his attention. So it's interesting. I'm not sure where this particular copy of the book is. It's probably in a library somewhere, where the censor has blacked out part of it. Pretty is maybe through laziness or lack of astuteness. He didn't notice that the same passage appears a bit later. I wanted just to add that this phenomenon of a Jewish man who is circumcised and the like enduring, lingering, almost like on how can I put it, the devotion to the mitzvah of bris milah endures even in Jewish circles that are very far from Jewish observance. It's not quite universal. Even in Israel, there are those who are trying to militate or agitate against the circumcision, and we certainly find that in other countries, including among Jewish people. But that is still a small minority, and even Jewish households, which are very far from Jewish observance, they still uphold the mitzvah of bris milah. It's a remarkable thing, the durability of it, and it's consistent with what the Medrash says, that Avraham Avinu will stand up on behalf of all of his descendants, except for these very extreme examples. I recall, I know we have some international listeners who may not be familiar, but I'm sure many of the British people here will recall, not Zachor Latov, a Jewish parliamentarian called Gerald Kaufman. He died a few years ago. He was known as the father of the house because he was, I think, the eldest parliamentarian. And he was a prominent and an outspoken and a long-standing member of parliament. He was Jewish, but he was no friend of the Jews, although in some limited cases perhaps he was. But certainly when it comes to Israel, he was an outspoken critic of Israel and certainly no friend of ours. But he once said, and he would, as many such Jews do, draw upon their Jewish background or Jewish identity as a weapon with which to enhance or to intensify their credibility in their criticism of Israel, which is very distasteful to me. He once said, I'm a Jewish person and I have the scar to prove it. And although, and I'm probably elicited some laughter in the the House of Commons. But actually, again, I'm no admirer of Gerald Kaufman, but there is a certain respect that I have that he was prepared to draw attention to the fact that he is circumcised. Now, you may wonder, as I did, whether he was married, who he married, and whether he would have been among those that Avram Avinu would still rescue from Gehinnom. According to what I've read, he never married. I mean, I don't know what his private life was all about, but he never married. So who knows, maybe in the next world, Avram Avinu has still come to his rescue. We won't know, I don't think. Certainly not in this lifetime. But in any case, I'm sure he's getting whatever he deserves in the next world. But I'm just saying that the Medrash hints to the importance that almost fundamental baseline Jewish identity, and all of those people Avram Avinu will seek to intercede on their behalf. So that's Pesach HaOhel Kechom Hayom, according to the heat at the heat of the day. I want to share with you a comment of Baal HaTurim now. In a different context. If you look in the Stone Chumash on page 92, it's a few couple of prakim later. So this is Perek Chaf. I'm looking at Pasuk Daled. So here the Torah has described how Avraham made his way to Gerar, and in Gerar, as in Mitzrayim in last week's Parasha, Sarah's beauty is a pitfall for her, and once again they engage in the same subterfuge in which Sarah says, I'm a sister, and Abraham as a result is not harmed, but she is abducted once again by Avimelech. And here we have a more extended dialogue, more so than we had with Paro. And Avimelech protests his innocence, and he says, "Besom levavim uvenikayon kapai." And I'm sorry, I want to look at the pasuk before that. He says in pasuk Gimel. So look at the back, the last lines on page 90. If you're with me in the Stone Chumash, so chapter 20, verse 3. Vayavo Elohim el Avimelech b'chalom halayla. God appears to Avimelech in a dream. He's given him the experience of a prophetic revelation. Vayomer lo, and he said to him, Hincha meis, you are going to die, or you're deserving of death, al isha shelakachta v'hibulas Baal, because of the woman whom you have seized, and she's a married woman. Then the pasuk continues, Vavimelech lo karav elea, he did not approach her. Vayomar Adonai hagoy gam tzadik ta'arog. Now, the reason he didn't approach her is because he was smitten with negaim, so he was prevented. It's not as if he was completely innocent. But in any case, says Avimelech, like in a retort to God, hagoy gam tzadik ta'arog. Now, if you've got the Stone Chumash, take a look at the translation there, because here we read, Avimelech had not approached her, so he said, "Oh my Lord, will you slay a nation even though it is righteous? Hagoy gam tzadik taharog. Will you slay a nation even though it's righteous?" So who is the nation? The nation is him, because he's the king. He represents the nation, and he's saying, "I am innocent." And he goes on to say that Avraham, said that she is my sister, and she said, he is my brother. So I thought they're brother and sister. She's not married. What I acted with complete innocence and cleanliness of hands. Says Baal HaTurim. His translation is going to be different than Rashi's. Baal HaTurim says that the meaning of the phrase is Hagoy gam tzadik taharog. Hang on a moment. Place in my sefer. Im taharog osi, says the Baal HaTurim in explaining what Abimelech says to Hashem. Im taharog osi, if you kill me, if you regard me, because Hashem said, Hincha meis, you're going to die. So Abimelech is defensive, and he says, if you kill me, if you execute me, gam Avraham hatzadik taharog, then you should execute Avraham as well. Kihu pasha v'garam lizos, because he sinned and he caused me to do this. Because Avram was one who initiated this subterfuge, this charade that they're not really married. Because again, Hashem said to Avimelech, you better release this woman because she's married. So Avimelech says right away, what do you mean she's married? Avram said that she's not married, they're just siblings. So according to Baal HaTurim, the translation is, if you would slay a nation, then would you also slay the righteous one? The righteous, Hagoy Gam Tzadik is Avraham. So he's saying, if you will slay me, will you slay Avraham as well? Of course, what he's hinting to is you're not going to find Avraham guilty of a capital crime, nor should you find me guilty of a capital crime, because he's the one who is responsible. Now, the interesting thing here is a couple of points. Firstly, when he says, when the pasuk says Hagoy Gam Tzadik Taharo, so it could be that just like Rashi understands that a nation, will you kill a righteous nation? So he is talking about himself as if he is the whole nation, because the king is associated with the nation is associated with the king. So when Avimelech says to Hashem, Hagoy Gam Tzadik Taharo, he means, will you slay the nation? Will you slay me? I'm the king of the nation. Could also be, however, that Baal HaTurim in this interpretation is using the word goy in the colloquial sense in which it is used, whether in the Yiddish or the Hebrew. Of course, the original meaning of the word goy, the biblical meaning, is a nation. It does not connote a Gentile nation. The Jewish people are called Mamleches Kohanim, V'goy Kadosh. So in the Torah usage, the word goy does not have a connotation of a non-Jewish person or a non-Jewish nation. Nevertheless, as we know, in colloquial usage, the word goy, which is not necessarily pejorative, by the way, but it's often used in a pejorative sense, has become associated with someone who is not Jewish. So it could well be that according to Baal HaTurim, when the Avimelech says, Hagoy Gam Tzadik Ta'arog, he says, if you're going to kill the goy, meaning me, then you should kill the righteous one, meaning Avram as well, because he led me astray. Now, I think this is quite interesting, because obviously he's trying to shift the blame. He is desperate and probably instinctively, in self-interest, looking to justify or at least to mitigate his wrongdoing by apportioning the blame to Avraham. There is a weakness, of course, in the argument of Avimelech, even though there is some truth to say, there is some truth to his allegation that Abraham bears a portion of the blame because he misled me. But at the end of the day, sexual predation is wrong and is criminal, whether the victim is married or unmarried. And even though there is a distinction to be made between adultery with a married woman and abducting a woman who is unattached, but they are both reprehensible. And certainly the latter scenario is not therefore benign and acceptable and innocent. So when Avimelech says, what do you mean I'm completely innocent? Of course, he's not completely innocent. And Avraham, and when he challenges Avraham and said, why did you mislead me this way? So Avraham says, let's find what Avraham says about it. If you look in Pasuk Yud Aleph, a little further on the page, Vayoma Avraham ki amarti rak ein yiras Elohim b'makom hazeh v'haraguni al dvar ishti. There is no fear of God in this place, and they might kill me because of my wife. So Avraham said, a place where there is no fear of God, then every kind of criminality, every kind of degeneracy, every kind of violence can take place and is almost like the door is open. There is no limit to the degeneracy and to the consequences of a place where there is no fear of God. So Abraham said, yes, it's true that, I was afraid for my life, and I felt that if Sarah was recognized as my wife, that I would be killed. But the reason that I engaged in this subterfuge is because I realized that there is no limit, there's no sort of inhibitions that will prevent the most heinous crime. And indeed, just like you've abducted her and you were prepared to abuse her and maybe to kidnap her permanently, so the same fate would have, and a worse fate maybe could have befallen me. Just want to add, in the couple of minutes we have left, so I do want to add a further third comment as well, study a third comment of Baal haTurim as well. But Rav Elchanan Wasserman, in his Kovetz Ma'amarim, has a short piece in which he comments on this, actually perhaps part of a longer essay, but anyway, he comments on this like assertion of Avraham Avinu. I'll read it again, Pasuk Yud Aleph, verse 11. Ki amarti, because I said rak ein yiraseh Elokim b'makom hazeh. Rak, the word rak means there is only lack of fear of heaven. There is only an absence of fear of heaven. Why does he say only? He could have simply said ki amarti ein yiraseh Elokim. There's no fear of God in this place. Why does he say rak? The implication is that there are many other admirable, maybe praiseworthy, perhaps even exemplary qualities that I find in this country. There may be rule of law, there may be a culture, there may be sophistication, there may be many, as I say, admirable and exemplary qualities. But there's one factor which is missing, and that factor renders null and void all the other accomplishments. There's no fear of heaven. In the absence of fear of heaven, every crime is possible. And although I don't know whether he had this in mind exactly, it's not impossible that he did. Germany was such a place. Germany was, in the days of Rav Elchanan Wasserman, was murdered by the Nazis in the Holocaust in 1943, I believe. Oh, certainly within those years. He, 42 possibly even, he was aware that Germany was very advanced culture and in so many ways science, and it was sort of at the pinnacle of world progress. And yet, in the absence of fear of heaven, any catastrophe, any calamity, and every possible breach of human decency is at risk. I once heard many years ago that some have suggested, I don't know in whose name it was, I heard many years ago, that maybe Avimelech can be identified with Hammurabi. You've heard of Hammurabi's code. So that, again, was a very early example of a legal system upon which subsequent legal systems, to a degree, were based. So maybe Avimelech, he was contemporaneous with Hammurabi. Maybe he was the same person, in which case Avram Avinu is saying there's a lot to admire about this place, but because there's no Yiras Elokim, there's no limit to the criminality and to the bloodshed that could ensue. And indeed, Hashem rebukes Avimelech forcefully for abducting a woman, whether she's married or even if she's unmarried. Such behavior is completely unacceptable. So again, that's how Baal haTurim explains it, that they turn a phrase. He says that Hagoy gam tarog. If you kill me, you should kill the righteous one as well, because he's responsible. Again, Avimelech, in a self-serving gesture, is simply trying to shift the blame. We've got a short while left, a minute or two, for a final comment. Later on, Avraham is troubled by the fact that his son Yishmael is acting up, and he is menacing Abraham's other son, his more distinguished son, Yitzchak. And if Abraham is upset by it, Sarah is certainly much more upset by it, to the point that she insists that Abraham, should drive away Hagar and the boy, Yishmael. And if you look on page 96 in the Stone Chumash, if you're with me in the Stone, otherwise it's Perek Chaf Aleph Pasuk Yud, chapter 21, verse 10. Vatomer Lavram Garesha Mahazos Vesbena. Drive out this maidservant and her son as well. Kilo Yirash ben Hamazosim bini im Yitzchak. I don't want this, the son of the maidservant, to inherit together with my son Yitzchak. And it says Mitzachek that Yishmael was menacing Yitzchak in various ways. So the Baal haTurim, as he often does, quotes the Masorah. We've said a few times, the Masorah is a series of notes that mention how many times, among other things, how many times a particular word appears in the Torah, even in all of Tanakh. And the precision and the mastery of the entire work, the 24 books of the Tanakh, is quite remarkable to see. And there is a tradition, you can still find it in some Chumashim as well today. So it says about haTurim, Gimel b'Masoras. The word Garesh appears 3 times in the Masoras. I'll just find you exactly the words of the Baal haTurim. Gimel b'Masoras, Garesh ha'ama, drive out this maidservant. Garesh leitz, drive away the scoffer in Mishlei, in Proverbs. And then it says, Kala garesh yigaresh. And that is said by Hashem to Moshe regarding how Paro will drive out the Jewish people. Kala entirely, garesh yigaresh eschem mizeh. Says the Baal haTurim. There is a connection between those 3 examples of garesh. And he says something very interesting. He says that driving away Yishmael was a fulfillment of what it says of Garesh Leitz, drive away the scoffer, the heretic. He's a malevolent influence. Sarah felt that Yishmael was a bad influence on Yitzchak. He was 14 years older than Yitzchak, and she felt he's a bad influence. Now Avram was reluctant to drive him away, although he did so because Hashem instructed him, listen to Sarah. But he was troubled by it. But nevertheless, it was a fulfillment, says Baal haTurim, of that pasuk in Mishlei. Va'az tigaresh haleitz. But there's a problem here. The problem is the 3rd pasuk, Kalei garesh yigaresh, the Jewish people were driven out of Mitzrayim. Says the Baal haTurim, a few words, listen to what he says. Ubishvil shegersha Sarah lahagar mi beisa. Because Sarah drove away Hagar from her household, ne'ensha Sarah was punished in that her descendants were subjugated to be driven from there. Where is there? There means Mitzrayim, because Hagar was an Egyptian woman. She was an Egyptian. The Torah says that explicitly. So because she was an Egyptian and she was on her way back to Egypt as well when she got lost in the desert, etc. So says the Baal haTurim, because Sarah insisted to drive her Hagar away, that's why she was punished, and that her descendants were subjugated, were enslaved in Egypt. Now, the Baal haTurim, in his longer Parish on the Torah, explains that, of course, we find, as I just mentioned 2 minutes ago, Hashem told Avraham, Shma b'kola, listen to Sarah. Rashi says to the kol nevuah, the voice of prophecy. So Sarah was right, and Avraham was compelled by divine decree to listen to Sarah. But, says the Baal haTurim, following the Ramban, she did it with undue harshness. Sarah could have been more sensitive. She could have been more diplomatic. She could have given her a golden handshake. She could have done it in a way which would not have been as harsh and have as unpleasant. And says the Baal haTurim, that's why the Jewish people, when they went to Mitzrayim, they could have gone somewhere else. They went specifically to Mitzrayim because of this. They could have lived there happily, in principle, in theory, in a different series of events, but they didn't. They were there happily at first, but it didn't last. The good times didn't last. Subsequently, as we very well know, they were subjugated and enslaved. When they left, they could have left with their heads held high. It's not exactly how they did. Of course, they left b'yad ramah, it says, but they were driven out. It wasn't by mutual agreement. It wasn't that they set a date and they gave them a send-off with, fanfare and a going away party. In the end, they were driven out of Mitzrayim. So ultimately the experience of Klal Yisrael Mitzrayim was, even in the departure, was not a pleasant one, and the exile itself could have been a lot more pleasant, and it was turned out to be completely unpleasant. Says the Baal HaTurim, that's because of this word garesh. It's hinted to, I should say, in the word garesh. Garesh, because we find gerushin here, we find it by the lates, it says in Mishle, and kala garesh chamiza. The Jewish people are also driven out. So according to this, the Baal HaTurim finds some fault with Sarah. So does Ramban, so does Radak as well, incidentally, and in this regard. So those are some thoughts for Parshas Vayera, selected from among many fascinating comments. And thank you to everybody for listening. This coming Shabbos, we're doing Shabbos Project at Kesher. We have the Whiskey Tish tomorrow night. Anybody who is local, please join us for the Whiskey Tish starting at 8:30. And we have a South African Kiddush Bonanza as well. So we have a lot happening. And also my subject for the Dvar Torah, which I'm sorry for those who paid attention to the publicity for today, was supposed to be called Gates of Gehinnom for tonight, but inadvertently we advertised tonight the topic of Shabbos, which is Undercover in Canaan, a Musar lesson for angels. So anyway, that's coming attractions. Please join us. Wish everybody a wonderful Shabbos.